He was probably drinking heavily at most stages in his adult life.
He liked being around young women.
The Nazi mass rallies are essentially theatrical stagings.
Tolstoy is the archetypal repentant nobleman.
It's basically absorbed into Macbeth.
His father, his uncles, his grandfathers, they all die. No role models.
Welcome to the Canon Club with Paul Morland and Ed West, exploring the Western canon in art, music and literature, one life at a time. This week...
The important bit of Romanesque is the Roman bit. At the beginning, suddenly you get these towns with 30 to 50,000 people, Low Countries, cloth-making towns and so on, London, Paris. They become big places. They're also hungry, really, for this type of new architecture. They're totally wrong. It's got nothing to do with the Goths, and they are actually much more flexible. You could actually say that the Renaissance is just another type of Romanesque, really.
The Romanesque.
Today we are discussing the emergence of a style of building which represents the birth of Western architecture, namely the Romanesque. Today across Europe there remain thousands of buildings which are still categorised as Romanesque. But what does the term mean? Where does it come from? And what define buildings of this kind? To help us find out, we're joined by John McNeill, an Oxford expert and prolific writer on the subject. John, before we get on to the Romanesque, tell us a little bit about yourself and your own interest in the subject.
Well, I became interested in Romanesque initially, actually, at university. I went to university to read an art history degree, and I was smitten with medieval architecture. And so I began really to sort of specialise in medieval architecture. And that was that. Actually, it just sort of grew and burgeoned, and I did a research degree and then started travelling, particularly in France, and got very interested in Western France, and very interested in cloisters. I'm very interested actually in an organisation called the British Archaeological Association, of which I'm the secretary. And the British Archaeological Association is concerned to use archaeological methods in order to understand upstanding structures which are above ground, particularly actually from the Middle Ages.
Well, thank you very much for that. Now, before we kick off, obviously we don't want to spend too much time on definition of terms, but I think we do need some kind of definition here about what we mean when we say the Romanesque. Can you help us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the important bit of Romanesque is the Roman bit at the beginning. And like all historical terms, it was really developed during the Enlightenment. So in the early 19th century, there's a correspondence, a rather interesting correspondence actually, between the sculptor John Flaxman and a man called William Gunn, who was interested in categorising medieval buildings. And Flaxman pointed out there was a certain sort of building which he found in and around Rome. Flaxman was in Rome at the time, which is not quite Roman. It's sort of based on Roman forms, but it's not really Roman. And he said that there's a word that the Romans use to describe families who've lived in Rome, for a few generations, but they're not truly and genuinely, utterly Roman. They can't trace their ancestry back. And so they're Romanish. They're sort of Roman. And that really was the origin of the term. It's a Romanesque. It's a not quite Roman form. And then a Norman antiquarian, Charles de Gerville, was wandering around the ruins at Jumièges, and he decided that the sort of building that he could see there was also not quite Roman, in the same way that he thought the language which was emerging in France at the time was not quite Latin. And so he related the two. And the term Romanesque is also related to the term Romance, which we use to describe languages which are actually based on Latin as a form of sort of debased Latin. So that's the sort of beginning of that as a word. There's also a big question actually about where is Romanesque. And this may be something to get out of the way initially. Romanesque is basically the architecture of the Latin Church, and therefore it has boundaries. And it's quite different to the architecture of the Greek Church, or what now will be thought of as being the Orthodox Church. And its boundary is very similar, in fact, to the boundary between the eastern and the western parts of the Roman Empire, as defined under Diocletian, with a sort of add-on up towards the north of it. So Croatia is Romanesque, Serbia is not. That's where your boundary actually runs. The whole of Italy is very much within the Romanesque. The Kingdom of Hungary is also Romanesque, whereas Bulgaria, Romania are not. And the northern extensions of them actually cut into the period that we're looking at. So the Christianization basically of Poland, the Baltic, Lithuania, Scandinavia is something which emerges, in fact, really over the course of the 10th, 11th, and actually into the early 12th centuries. And so that's basically its boundaries. You've got a few rather odd and interesting outliers. The architecture which is developed under the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, for example, after the First Crusade, is basically a Romanesque export into the Eastern Mediterranean. But that's more or less where you find it. And when do you find it? Well, roughly between about the year 1000 and about 1200.
John, could you give us the background about the political situation in Europe in the 11th century? It's obviously a very important century, and also a bit about the differences between the early Middle Ages or Dark Ages and the High Middle Ages, which begin around this time, and the kind of huge transformations in the church and in Western European society.
Well, the 11th century is chaotic and very, very fragmented in ways that the 12th century essentially isn't. And so it's enormously variable. I mean, in certain parts, England, for example, you actually have a functioning kingdom and therefore a certain measure of sort of unity and political authority. And what the king says, to an extent, actually can be followed on the ground, whereas the situation in France is entirely different. And France is sort of politically entirely fragmented. Doesn't really exist as an entity. In fact, there's no such thing territorial as France. There's just an area where the Franks live. And in the empire, which is to say the area we now tend to think of as being the sort of borderlands of France and Germany, most of Germany, Switzerland, and in fact most of sort of northern Italy. Again, there's very, very loose authority. And in certain areas, it functions extremely well. So the Rhineland, for example, it's a sort of haven of stability, whereas what you get down towards the south is not. And the historians tend to talk about a rupture in political authority, which emerges in the late 10th and late 9th century, largely as a result of incursions on the part of nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples, particularly in the northwest of Europe, the people we usually call Vikings or Danes. They destabilize the situation, and as authority evaporates, then you actually get these sort of local warlords who eventually seize power. And what they do is they take over what previously were elective or appointed positions, people known as counts or viscounts, and they usurp those, and they usurp the sort of public goods that go with them, and they begin to pass them down within their own families, and that leads to this increasing sort of fragmentation and petty warfare as well. And warfare brings economic.
I was just saying, feudal anarchy is the term sometimes used for this period in what is now France, of sort of constant war between different barons over land and castles.
Yes, yeah. I mean that's fair enough, and that's really the situation you have, and it begins to calm down in the second half of the 11th century, and you begin to get investment essentially, and a more peaceable sort of environment. I mean, it also goes with another thing which we're becoming much more conscious of now, which is very significant population growth. And a much more benign climate as well. So the sort of early Middle Ages basically very cold, and the temperature starts actually to rise round about the year 1000, and it peaks in the late 13th century. And that leads to the bringing of much more land into cultivation, higher survival rates, and so on. And what goes with that, which, to use the jargon, we call nucleation. That is to say that it's worth investing in towns and villages, actually creating communities which tend to nucleate rather than having a lot of dispersed semi-nomadic sort of living.
Well, it's good to hear that the Romanesque architecture has got demographic roots, just like pretty much everything else, I would argue. But I want to just focus a little more on the question of when is the Romanesque. So you've kind of answered that question. And yet I, as I think we've discussed, am currently not very far from the Abbey of Saint-Michel de Cuchet, which I've actually taken Ed round, and which I believe is 9th century. You know, there are buildings that predate what we're calling the Romanesque era. So what is it about, and maybe in the case of Saint-Michel and other such places, there are foundations which are earlier, but they only really can be called Romanesque buildings insofar as the buildings today that are there are of a later date than their foundation. But tell us a little bit about buildings before that. So we've got was it really Roman buildings and then nothing except a few shacks and huts until we enter the Romanesque?
They're small scale. I mean, the really big difference is in terms of ambition and the technology which enables people to start quarrying stone again. So you go to somewhere like Saint-Michel de Cuchet, and Saint-Michel de Cuchet is basically, the base of it is mostly reused Roman masonry. And everything above that, if you look at them carefully, you see they're all rounded, right? They're just dredging them up from the local river courses, and they're mixing them with a very, very thick mortar in relatively thick walls as such. And one of the revolutions in Romanesque is you start to have buildings which are created out of what we call dressed stone. That is to say, it's cut into blocks, and they cut actually from fresh quarries. So they're recovering the quarrying industry, whereas virtually everything in the early Middle Ages, with the exception of the sort of Carolingian period, tends actually to simply reuse Roman stone or its rubble construction if it survives. What we don't have, and we know was almost ubiquitous, was actually quite high quality timber building, and it just doesn't survive. So you can think of these as once having much more elaborate roofscapes than they now actually have. And we know quite a bit about that actually in Anglo-Saxon England, about the quality of timber building in Anglo-Saxon England. Our real problem is one of survival rates. That is to say that survival rates for 12th century building are actually very high because they're well built. And survival rates for 9th and 10th century buildings are actually very low. So most of the evidence is either documentary or it comes from archaeology. So you have plans, you have footprints, and bits of debris and so on that we can say something about. But I think we've historically underestimated the amount of building that's going on in the 9th and 10th century. There's quite a lot of it, but a lot of it isn't really long-term building. It's a sort of timber building, which is always thought of as being a sort of relatively medium-term at best. It's the sort of thing that will survive 50 years and then you'll replace it, where stone building is meant to last forever.
John, we're aware that in the early Middle Ages, people were conscious of living in the shadow of a greater civilization, and the ruin, the Old English poem about the race of giants. Can we draw links between this architecture and a sort of a desire to emulate the classical past, or was it just that's what was there and that's what they were aware of?
Yes, I mean there is. I mean, there's a great revival there's an intellectual side to the 11th and 12th centuries in which a lot of particularly Latin authors are seen as being exemplary, and so their works are actually copied. And so the way in which people start to understand history is through the lens of an antique past. And if you read biographies of 11th and 12th century figures written by their contemporaries, they tend to model them on Suetonius's Life of the Caesars. So everything sort of starts to sound much more Roman. And you get a lot of what we would think of as being sort of laments, really. There's a famous couplet that Hildebert de Laverdin actually wrote round about 1100. He said, "Rome without compare, though all but shattered, your very ruins tell of greatness once enjoyed." And there's a lot of that interest actually in antiquity and what goes with it, which is the fact that Rome, a pagan culture, no longer survives, and we live in a sort of Christian culture which is reviving upon the ruins of the past. As another phrase Bernard of Chartres uses, he said, we are but dwarves on the shoulders of giants. So they're conscious that actually there are astonishing achievements to be found actually in Rome, but they are surpassing those achievements simply because they're on the back of them.
Do we know if this is just that? Because we know that literacy must be going up from at least the time of Charlemagne, because, based on the number of documents that survive, seem to massively increase. And presumably the higher literacy is the cause of this, and the greater, not just strength of the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church undergoes its sort of Reformation at this time, doesn't it, in the 11th century?
Yeah, no, very much so. Europe internationalizes, essentially. You can. One of the reasons why you get far more documents is because you've got law, and a law always creates records. It creates lots and lots of documents, and much of the stuff that we have, these are charters. On the whole, it's a sort of and an increasing interest actually in creating a sort of legal framework whereby people and institutions might actually live. So there's a massive institutional reform of which the papacy play a really very important role. And a part of that is the large-scale reform of the church. And what that means is that the church institutionally is beginning to sort of pull together. And rather than the landlords, the landowners, the sort of mighty people, and great men actually endowing and building churches, at least in the first instance, what the church is trying to do is trying to wrest control of those institutions so that they themselves actually have the rights of appointment over them. This is known as the investiture controversy. Who invests a bishop? Who appoints a bishop? As such, does the sort of local count appoint the bishop, or does some sort of outside entity actually appoint it? And it starts out really with initially the Emperor Henry III, because the Holy Roman Empires maintain that they actually have authority over what was the Roman Empire. What does that mean? Well, nobody's entirely sure in the 11th century what it means, but they try to impose their control on Rome. The bishops of Rome have, for the previous 200 years, actually been divvied up between various important Roman families. It's a local bishopric, essentially, is the papacy. And all that starts to change in the late 1030s, early 1040s, under Henry III. And he appoints 4 popes in rapid succession. They're all outsiders. So these are people coming from Germany or from France or from southern Italy. They're being brought into Rome, and they create around themselves a sort of body of advisors, what we call the papal curia. And that curia is, or court, this is the court of the Pope. It's just emerging at that period. And it's emerging largely because they're importing these ecclesiastics, usually from monasteries. They have a very monastic background, most of the 11th century popes, and they're bent on the reform of the church and a sort of idea about imposing clerical celibacy, abolishing pluralism, simony, the buying of sees and so on. And it's a long sort of process, this. It takes them about a century before something comes out of it at the end as a sort of compromise, really, at a great council, which is held at Worms, and they decide that the temporalities, that is to say, the actual estates and land that are held by bishops, that's invested by the local landowner or magnate or king, and the spiritualities, the actual appointment, is actually managed by the church, and that sort of pretty much then runs through the Middle Ages as such. But that's a huge difference, and ultimately it owes a tremendous amount to the fact that all of these figures are coming into Rome suddenly from outside, and that it utterly internationalizes the church.
So I think what we're seeing, understanding this historical social, economic, and religious background, in a way, is a coming together of the West, the formation of the West. I suppose you then get sort of economies of scale. You get a scale movement of theology, of language, of writing, and of architecture. And I suppose what you then have is a sharing of knowledge. Can we just look a little bit about what these buildings are like? So what were the techniques that were being developed that allowed people to build on this kind of scale for the first time since Roman period? And what were the models? What did these buildings look like? What were they for? Were they all churches or abbeys? Perhaps you can cover that.
Well, the majority that survive, which are stone built, are of course churches and abbeys, and there's an innate sort of conservatism that's built into that. And sort of secular buildings, particularly in towns. I mean, they're as much under development pressure in the 15th century as they are in the 19th and the 20th century. So they tend to keep pulling them down and replacing them. So we don't have very many domestic buildings. There are certain places which would amaze most people. Pisa, for example, has the greatest collection of 11th and 12th century stone buildings anywhere in Europe, or Cluny. And it's just remarkable that these places actually survive. But we don't have many of those. We have a lot more castles, though most of those castles we actually have are slighted. That is to say, they've been rendered unusable, and therefore they're sort of fossilized at a certain state, usually in the sort of 16th or 17th centuries. And they're actually sort of stone built. What we're missing in the Romanesque period are large-scale wooden buildings. So take the Bayeux tapestry, for example. 80% of the castles that you see on the Bayeux tapestry are wooden, right? They're wooden towers built on top of mottes, and you can see they're earth-fast posts. They're actually built of planks, and that's usually how sort of castles existed in the 11th century. And then they're replaced. They're usually replaced in the 12th century by stone-built structures. And there are sort of several reasons for that. The most important is that castles proliferate in the second half of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century because people are forming villages and towns. And we have a very good insight into this in England because we have a document called Domesday. And the Domesday book actually gives you the status quo ante and the status quo. So it tells you what the situation was in 1066, and it tells you what the situation is in 1086. So you can see how it is that land has been taken from one group of people and it's been given to, by and large, a different group of people, and that they in turn are actually distributing it to their subtenants, and their subtenants are trying to develop their estates. And the way that you do that is you put a castle up, beneath it you build a church, and you open a market, and then you attract settlers into your town. And your castle, usually it's built on a mound, so it's soft earth in the first instance, right? You can't really stick a durable stone structure on that, so they put a timber tower on it, and by 1100, if they're succeeding, then they replace that with a stone structure. And those are the ones we actually have at a sort of secular level. To come then round to what's happened ecclesiastically, then it's very difficult now actually to know what lit the blue touch paper, as it were. We can see a lot of things happening to either side of the year 1000. And most of the stuff that's happening in the 980s, 990s, we don't actually have, but we know from excavation, usually in unfortunate circumstances. So much of the archaeology that was done in Germany, for example, was done as a result of the destruction of many German cities during the Second World War. And what happened after that was this exemplary series of excavations. And suddenly we start to know exactly what Cologne or Worms or Nuremberg were like round about the year 1000. We can see there's big investment actually in the sort of 980s, 990s there. So it's not just a millennial thing. It's not just that everybody heaves a huge sigh of relief in the year 1000 and thinks, well, it's worth investing in building now. It's actually, it predates that. So there is an element of that in it. And there's a famous quote from Raoul Glaber, who's a chronicler writing in the 1030s, saying that, Europe was suddenly covered after the year 1000 with a white mantle of churches, he says. And he's talking about a particular situation. He's from Burgundy, and that is happening in Burgundy, but it's already been happening sort of elsewhere. And the forms that they start to use are explicitly Roman forms. But above all, and we keep getting this in the document, they're building them ex quadris lapides, out of squared stones. So they're actually developing quarries, and they're building in a new sort of way. They're not just taking down old Roman buildings and cobbling them back together. They're actually sort of very, very carefully planning the stonework. And what goes with that is coordination, really, between the people in the quarry, the patrons, and the people that are actually designing and building the church. And they're quite centralized initially. So there's a group of buildings in France. All of the stone comes from a single area in the Nivernais, right? So Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, Gemini-des-Prés, these really quite famous buildings, and in northern Burgundy as well. They're all sort of, getting their stone from the same basic source, and they're putting it together in the same way. And what then happens is that they start to, again, this is to use the jargon, they start to articulate the building. And what we mean by that is that in Roman building, generally speaking, if you're building a hall, a basilica, then the wall is a continuous plane, right? It might be on top of columns, but there's nothing that projects out from it. Whereas in Romanesque building, they have a tendency, in fact, to start to put vertical articulation, which means to say they put pilasters or half columns in front of it. And they do something with it, which in Roman building you do get, but not in the same sort of combination. So if you think of the Colosseum, for example, then it uses half columns to actually frame the arches, but the half columns never support the arches. They're part of the exterior elevation. Whereas in the Romanesque building, they're using half columns to not only articulate the elevation so they project outwards, but they're using them to support arches as well. They're getting them to do two jobs. And that sort of hits at where Romanesque departs from Roman. Every form that they use is actually, it has a Roman antecedent or precursor, but they're starting to combine them in new ways. And transposition is the mother of invention. What I mean by that is taking something from one place and combining it with something else actually creates a new architecture. And that's sort of starting to happen really in the sort of 1020s. There's a man called Meinwerk, who's the Bishop of Paderborn, and he builds a tiny chapel that actually survives, dedicated to St. Bartholomew. Next, it's right between what was Charlemagne's great Saxon palace and the cathedral at Paderborn. It's tiny, and it's built in 1017 in 1 year per operaios Grecos, right, by Greek workmen, we think possibly from southern Italy, possibly from elsewhere, but not actually from Greece. And it uses half columns, and it's the earliest datable example. There are probably earlier examples that we just don't have, or we don't know the date of them, but it's the earliest datable example. And suddenly they're all over the place. Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, Auxerre after 1023. And what goes with that actually is a particular way of coordinating the masonry. At Saint-Germain at Auxerre, they put the half column on the underside of an arch. And that's the birth, that's the great-great-grandfather of medieval mouldings that you have there. So there's quite a lot happening at that period, but it takes time to start to sort of filter through, as it were, and really sort of take off.
John, I'm always interested in the idea of when exactly the medieval Christendom overtook Rome in certain areas, because obviously there was a huge decline in various indices of civilization in the early medieval period. But would these buildings you mentioned from the early 11th century, would they be technically superior to a Roman construction from the 2nd century AD, for example? What are they already now more advanced? Or is that a difficult question to kind of answer?
It is a bit difficult, but actually there are some. It's a very interesting question, and you pose it very well. I would say that in terms of scale, for Christian churches, by the third quarter or the fourth quarter, by the last 25 years, really, of the 11th century, they're very conscious that it's possible to actually surpass the size of the Constantinian buildings in Rome. And it's very obvious also, because we have a couple of insights into this, that people actually measured up Old St. Peter's, and they used the measurements of Old St. Peter's as the basis actually for certain buildings as well. And the real giants, I mean, you can measure scale, obviously, in various different ways. You can measure it in terms of height or breadth or length. But if you measure it in terms of length, the longest buildings ever created in the Middle Ages, which are longer than any of the Roman halls, any of the Roman basilicas, all date really from a very short period at the end of the 11th century. They're all in rivalry with each other. So the Winchester Cathedral, there's the third church at Cluny, Santiago de Compostela. They're very widely dispersed, these buildings, and they're all well over 450, 500 feet. Whereas Old St. Peter's, basically it's about 400. So as soon as you get to that sort of scale, you can say, actually, they may well think that they are surpassing Rome. But there are certain things that they can't do and don't really seem to be all that interested in. So they can't make concrete. They could never actually create vaults on the scale of Rome, but they do admire them. I mean, they admire the Pantheon, and the Pantheon actually survives. The reason it survives, I should say, the Pantheon is a Christian church. It still is a Christian church. It's why you don't have to pay to go in to the Pantheon. And it's converted into a Christian church in the 7th century. It becomes the major stational church for the Virgin Mary, in fact, in Rome. And therefore it locks it into a particular sort of a set of Christian references. So they do try to imitate elements of the Pantheon, but the bits that they imitate are really the shape and the detailed handling of the niches that you have around it. They don't and they can't possibly emulate the vault to it. So they never surpass that.
You've talked about Cluny and Winchester and Santiago de Compostela, and that brings in mind a question which I've got, which is, can we talk about real regional variations? Or is this just something where each building's slightly different? And within that, can you talk a bit about what we mean by Norman in Britain? Is that just Romanesque, or is there something distinctly British or English about the buildings of that era that we have in the British Isles?
Well, to take the first question on, then most Romanesque buildings from different parts of Europe look rather different to each other, and it's a terribly loose term in that sense. And most Romanesque architecture is actually regional architecture, though there is a sort of trans-regional type of architecture, which you do find, which is largely best understood in symbolic terms. In other words, you have an archetype, take the Pantheon or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and you try and imitate it. And that sort of that's an international phenomenon as such. Baptisteries, centrally planned buildings are often like that. But otherwise, yes, it's regional, though the nature of the region tends to change very significantly. So in Germany, you don't really get many regional variations. Sort of imperial German architecture is pretty much the same all the way from sort of Switzerland to Holland. And there is a sort of west-east divide, not exactly a divide, but there is a sort of Western English type of Romanesque architecture, and there's an Eastern English type of Romanesque architecture. But those are big regions. And you go to France, and it's a very, very different altogether. I mean, the sort of style of architecture that you get in the Auvergne is like nothing else. And the style of architecture you get in Umbria is like nothing else in Italy. And sort of Tuscan architecture is totally different to sort of Apulian architecture. So those are sort of sub-regions almost. They're small regions. And it's no coincidence, I think, that actually that they go with polities which actually are terribly fragmented. So there is no overall administrative authority which you have in those areas. The second question, Norman, that is a bit of a trap that we've sort of fallen into, in the sense that there are different ways of categorizing medieval architecture. And a man called Thomas Rickman wrote an attempt to discriminate the styles of architecture from the Anglo-Saxons to the Tudors. And so he came up with this ragbag, really, of terms. So there's Anglo-Saxon, there's Norman, there's then what he calls early English. So some of these are dynastic terms. Some of them are stylistic, decorated, perpendicular. And those are sort of terms that we still sort of tend to use alongside terms that are used in Europe as well. And because Rickman thought there was almost no Anglo-Saxon architecture to speak of, that therefore Romanesque became confused with Norman. And it's a problem in the sense that there is also an architecture in Normandy. And Norman architecture in Normandy is all architecture in Normandy. So we have this slight sort of problem. So we talk about Anglo-Norman architecture, which sort of deals with that to an extent, but there is this underlying sense that somehow Anglo-Saxon architecture isn't Romanesque and Norman is. So you create a completely artificial sort of 1066 division between the two, which is sort of exercise. It's a big subject at the moment, is that. I mean, what do we really mean by that? And, not everybody, not the people that actually put the buildings together, the rude mechanicals, they aren't all killed in 1066. They go on working. So we have what are known as overlap buildings. These are buildings that actually look very Anglo-Saxon, but they actually date from the 1070s and 1080s. And there's one building, which is pre-1066, which William of Malmesbury, writing in the 1120s, commented on. And he said, this is Westminster Abbey, which is begun by Edward the Confessor. And he says, this is the first building in the new style, he says, that we actually have. So that's a Norman building in England in the 1050s, as it were, there. So there is this sort of overlap. And I would say that there are buildings that you're inclined to think, Bradford-on-Avon, St. Lawrence at Bradford-on-Avon, that looks rather Romanesque, you'd say. And that dates from the beginning of the 11th century, and it's very Anglo-Saxon. I know. So there is a sort of problem. It's something that we may explore, actually. Duke William the Bastard, subsequently William the Conqueror, was born at some point between the autumn of 1027 and the summer of 1028, which means that we're in for a millennial anniversary of William the Conqueror, and the Conseil Régional of Normandy have decided that 2027 is the year. So there are going to be lots of exhibitions and so on, exploring one of those themes. There's one at the British Library as well that will come up.
That should be interesting. I mean, Edward the Confessor was, of course, half Norman, and there were already Normans relatives. So England was obviously coming under the influence of northern France. Can I ask you to move on to explain a little bit about Gothic and how it differs from Romanesque, and also what are the kind of cultural and social forces that are driving this new kind of architecture? Because Gothic is obviously also a term, isn't it? It wasn't called out at the time.
It is. It's an insult. Yes. Yeah. It was first used by a Florentine, a man called Marsilio Ficino, and he thought that the broken arches were a terrible sort of form, and they were weak as such. And he associated them with barbarian invaders and the barbarians, and the principal invaders in Italy were the Goths. So it must be a sort of Gothic architecture here. And he was followed
barbarism from the north.
Yeah, or the east. Raphael said exactly the same thing. They're totally wrong. It's got nothing to do with the Goths, and they are actually much more flexible and ultimately, dynamically, they dispose of stresses much more efficiently than do round arches. But a pointed arch is only one aspect, actually, of what we tend to think of as being Gothic architecture. And it comes into being sort of, traditionally we think of Saint-Denis under an abbot called Suger as creating the earliest Gothic building between about 1140 and 1144. And then you can see Gothic really being adapted initially as a rather regional sort of style in northeastern France and the Paris Basin. And step by step, you can see it sort of beginning to be disseminated into northern Burgundy at Vézelay, and then most remarkably at Canterbury in 1174. And that's the first intimation you have that this is a sort of newly understood type of architecture which might actually really take off. And take off it does in almost all of Latin Europe, except really for Italy. Italy, the Gothic never really sort of takes root in Italy. There are just a few Gothic buildings, as it were, in an area in which walls are so valued as vehicles to carry wall paintings that they really aren't interested in big windows, and big windows are Gothic architecture.
Does that mean the Romanesque lives on in Italy?
Sort of, yes. I mean, you could actually say that the Renaissance is just another type of Romanesque, really. I mean, there have been attempts to do that. It's a bit glib, really, to say that, but Italy goes its own way, and Rome utterly goes its own way. When Roman buildings actually remain looking like Roman buildings, it's easy to sort of miss this. But what Romans love is architectural colour and, above all, lustrousness, polish. They like marbles, and that all the way through. From the point at which Augustus sort of develops the great Carrara marble quarries, right the way through to the Victor Emmanuel Monument. I mean, it's marble, polish, colour. In a big way, and so the late antique buildings that you have remain the models that they continue building, and in some cases you can't really tell when they're actually built, because they fall down and they just put them back up again, really using exactly the stuff that has survived there.
But to come back to Ed's question about what else was going on, the development, the high and late Middle Ages. I mean, so first of all, can you tell us a little bit about what else was happening around the time that you get the transition from Romanesque to Gothic, if we can call it that? And also, is it right to see it as some kind of progress? Is there some kind of teleology in archaeological history? Or, I mean, that presumably is a debatable subject. So can you cover both of those? Is it, what else is going on, and is it progress?
It's change. I'm sorry to sort of duck the question. I mean, in engineering terms, I mean, they take your breath away. I mean, major Gothic buildings, and they're probably intended to have something of that, to sort of evoke, the almost miraculous in their construction. They're very expensive. They're primarily urban. So one of the things that's happening is that towns are really expanding. And whereas the majority of buildings that are really being invested in the 11th century tend to be sort of rural, they're community churches, what we think of as parish churches, or the monastic, actually, you're starting to get really big town churches in the 12th century, and they often, the big cathedrals are starting to adopt this as well. You're also getting much more centralized models, and that makes Gothic architecture much easier. So the French court, it sort of moves to Paris, essentially. So Paris, actually, not a terribly significant place at the beginning of the 11th century, becomes a very significant place, really, in the 12th century. We think of it as a capital. We think, and it is a capital, and increasingly that's where the sort of French state apparatus begins actually to develop, and they're huge patrons, and they're interested in financing a lot of building. And there are economies, you've already mentioned these economies of scale that tend to go with that. So you get large-scale development of quarries and so on. And you get the occasional pioneer who's also important in this. So you have to have the innovators, actually, if the architecture is going to change. And when it comes to Saint-Denis, who that innovator is is sort of open to question. But the patron sujet is obviously asking certain questions of an architect, which can only be answered by innovating. So he wants big windows and vaults and columns, and nobody's ever sort of put those together before. And the architect comes up with some sort of solution for it, and it appeals. It appeals initially to monastic patrons, and so that idea is sort of disseminated. But I say it's urbanism is the great driver of Gothic architecture. Its development and the increasing expansion of towns. So that towns, as far as we can see in the 11th century, sort of 2 or 3, a population of between sort of 2 and 5,000. That's really pretty sort of substantial. And suddenly you get these towns with 30 to 50,000 people in them. Low countries, cloth making towns, and so on. London, Paris, they become big places there, and they're also hungry, really, for this type of new architecture.
So again, it's got a good demographic foundation, the shift to the Gothic.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And those people actually export. The one area, I suppose, or one of the areas we haven't really said anything about is Spain. And Spain is expanding very rapidly as a sort of Christian polity, and it's desperately short of people, and so it's having to pull people into it. And a lot of those actually are coming from France, particularly Western France and Southwestern France. Or to put it in a different way, you actually are getting a sort of surplus in population, which is capable, therefore, of actually settling lands which have been devastated. They've become, they talk about the repopulation and the depopulation, but it's not quite that. These lands are never absolutely deserted, but they're sort of lawless places, and therefore they're the sort of places that, sort of bandits and desperate people and holy men and so on live in. But you can't defend your property or plant food because you're too vulnerable as such. And so when they actually do manage to move southwards, really in the end of the 11th century, they've got nobody to repopulate it with. So it takes time, and these new settlers are coming in. So your demographic is important.
Well, it's been really interesting understanding the development and the styles. But if some of our listeners are now interested and their appetites have been whetted, can you suggest some places they might go, perhaps predominantly in the UK or in England, but maybe also in some of the major places they might want to visit, say in France or Italy, Germany or Spain? Just pick out a few major buildings that if you were taking someone on a tour of the Romanesque for a week or two, where would you take them?
Well, sort of in England, I think I'd mix it up a bit. And I'd take them to Durham, whose reputation is assured in this matter. It's really stunning. Achievement is Durham in all sorts of ways. I think I'd take them to one of the big East Anglian churches, whether it's Ely or Norwich. It's a very different sort of Romanesque there. It's sort of really sort of luminous and light-filled and very sort of systematic, really, in its deployment of forms. I'd throw in a couple of small churches as well, because it's one of the things that in which Romanesque architecture really changes in the course of the 12th century, is with the deployment of architectural sculpture on the part of specialist architectural sculptors. And this starts to appear in parish churches in the course of the 1130s. And there's nowhere better to look at that than sort of Herefordshire, Monmouthshire, that's sort of the southern Welsh marches. Sort of take somewhere like Kilbeck as an absolute classic. One of the great small buildings of Europe, really. And something like Romsey, actually, that's a big nun. That's a small nunnery, but beautifully sort of formed. Overseas, then go to St Nicola at Bari. That's wonderful. That's the pilgrimage church, along with Santiago de Compostela, sort of par excellence. But St Nicola at Bari has its own particular flavour. It's built right against the sea. It's like a sort of beacon. It's built out of this astonishing stone as well, which is not quite marble, but it just reflects the marine light, and it's east facing. Is really very wonderful. Go to the cloister at Moissac. That's the sort of Big Bang cloister, really. We know it's very precisely dated. It's nearly all there, and it's how monastic cloisters. You can see how monastic cloisters work if you go there, or Vézelay, in France, or Spire Cathedral. I think those would be my pick.
And whilst we have you on the subject, and I'm speaking to you from my own parochial little corner of France, what's particular about the Romanesque churches of this valley, the whole of Roussillon, really? What marks that out?
It's a sort of two-phase architecture, really. So on the one hand, you have a lot of masons sort of struggling to actually build with geologically very, very difficult conditions, because most of the stone down there it's not nice stone that you can cut into big square blocks. It's not sedimentary stone as such. It's mostly what they call igneous, and it's very difficult to get the mortar to stick to it. And so they're phenomenal builders there. But then they begin to develop these new quarries, particularly around Villefranche, and you get this pink marble there that actually was very heavily veined, rather beautiful, and that sort of really switches then, and they can carve it. They can actually sort of put in sort of really good carvings in that area. They're basically small, because they have to be small, because you can't build with that stone on a very, very grand scale. So, even the major monastic churches, and Saint-Michel-de-Coucher, it's a very rich, very wealthy foundation, is Saint-Michel. It's not a big building at all, but it does have it did have a big cloister before it went there. It sort of looks in two directions, doesn't it? It looks actually up into the mountains on the one hand, it looks across the Mediterranean. So just over the border, it's not your valleys, but if you go to a place called Saint-Père-de-Rodez, you can see how connected it really is with Italy. The same to an extent is true of Elm Cathedral as well. That has these sort of rather Roman features to it.
John, that's been enormously insightful, and I hope that those listening, and I can certainly speak for myself, will feel a lot more educated and a lot more informed